Chapter 1. Tabitha Murphy set out on her long walk to the post office in Beckham, Massachusetts, wondering if her life would ever be any different. She worked for a family who lived near her in the rural area south of Beckham, doing anything they needed. Every day she would help Mrs. Matthews round up her 8 children, usually taking one or more with her when she was asked to go on any kind of errand. Today, however, the children were with their father, helping him harvest apples, so she was able to sneak away to the post office without 4 or 5 children swarming around her. When she reached the post office, she saw the older sister of one of her closest friends, Elizabeth Tandy, who had once been Elizabeth Miller. "How are you today, Mrs. Tandy?" Elizabeth smiled. "I'm doing just fine. What are you up to?" "Picking up the mail for the Matthews." "Thankfully Mr. Matthews took all the children to pick apples with him, so I don't have 6 of them hanging from my skirt." She brushed a tendril of dark hair out of her eyes. Without the children, she tended to walk faster, and then she looked a mess when she arrived at her destination. She'd rather look a mess than have all the children with her. "I also need to go to the general store after I finish here." Tabitha knew she should be thankful to be employed, but working for the Matthews was difficult at times. "I'm surprised the Matthews children haven't gotten a terrible nickname like my younger siblings did," Elizabeth said, referring to the nickname her own younger siblings had received, the Demon Horde. "Me too. From my point of view, and you know I went to school with so many of your siblings, the Matthews children are much worse. Sounds like you need a new job. If only I could find a man that I wanted to marry. There just aren't any good men left in Beckham." Elizabeth grinned, tilting her head to one side. "I can help with that, you know." And everyone did know. Elizabeth Tandy was a matchmaker, sending women to marry men in the West as their mail-order brides. Tabitha shook her head. "I refuse to become part of your mail-order myths." Elizabeth laughed. "They're not myths. I've had so many successful matches. I'm sure we could find you a man you'd be happy with. I'm not sure I'm even up to trying. Come see me after work today. Let me show you a letter. As soon as it was in my hands, I thought of you, and I was planning to send Bernard out to talk to you about it anyway." "Your parents don't need you here, do they?" Tabitha frowned. "No, I don't think they really do need me, but I never thought about leaving them either." Elizabeth smiled. "Come for supper, and we'll talk." "All right?" Tabitha really didn't know what to say. She didn't believe a mail-order bride scenario would work for her or anyone else on the planet. But she felt the need to humor the older woman. "All right. I'll let my mother know as I pass by our house on the way back to the Matthews." "Sounds good. I'll see you about 6. I'll be there." As Tabitha picked up the mail, shopped, and walked the long way back to the Matthews, she couldn't stop thinking about the idea of being a mail-order bride. Sure, she wanted to marry and not be working for the Matthews and beholden to her parents forever, but the idea of marrying a stranger? Would he expect to have a wedding night when they'd just met? What kind of arrangement would it be? What if she traveled to wherever he was by train, and he didn't bother to show up at the station? What if he just left her there, with no ticket for a ride home, and nowhere to go? Oh, the possibilities were terrible, and she knew she would be the one they happened to. Life was simply like that for her. If she expected to have apple pie for supper, her mother would make strawberry pie, which broke her out in hives, and she would forget to tell her what she'd made. Oh, the scenarios were endless. If something was going to go wrong, it always went wrong for her. She took one step inside the house and called out, "Mother, I won't be home for supper, but I don't have time to chat. I have to return to the Matthews." "All right, dear. I did recently learn there's a man at church who is interested in courting you. Do you know Elmer Jorgensen? The pig farmer who takes all 10 kids to church every Sunday, who obviously hasn't bathed in a month." "That very same man." Tabitha looked at her mother with shock. And you think this would be a good match for me? I don't see you finding another. Tabitha nodded wearily. Thanks for your confidence in me, Mother. She shut the door and kept walking toward the Matthews house. The order from the store had been large enough that the store owner had agreed to deliver it for no charge, which meant Tabitha's hands were free, other than the mail. As soon as she arrived at the Matthews home, she put on an apron and took the mail to Mrs. Matthews, who was sitting in her rocking chair, staring out the window. Are you all right, Mrs. Matthews? She asked. I just found out I'm expecting again. My baby is 6, and I thought I was finished with having little ones. What am I going to do? I'll need to hire another girl, because you're already overworked, and it's not at all good that I make you do so much. Tears were falling down Mrs. Matthews's face, and Tabitha wanted to tell her she'd just work harder, but she couldn't make the words come out of her mouth. She was overworked. No one should do as much as she did for 20 cents per day. I'm sorry, life is getting overwhelming, Tabitha said. I'll live. Mrs. Matthews brushed her tears away and stood up. I made lunch for Roger and the children. Would you mind carrying it down to the apple orchard? She shook her head. Just pray that none of them have fallen out of trees this time. I don't need another Dr. Bill, with a little one coming. Tabitha happily took the food and left the house. She knew Mrs. Matthews well enough to know she was trying to get Tabitha to take a wage cut, or agree to work more during her time there, but she refused. She did feel sorry for Mrs. Matthews, but she was not about to put her own health at risk to help the stingy woman. Arriving at the apple orchard, she called out that she'd brought lunch, and the children swarmed her. Mrs. Matthews had wrapped all the food she'd sent into a large quilt, which Tabitha spread out and set the food out in a pleasing manner. Mr. Matthews tended to be much kinder than Mrs. Matthews. Go back to the house, Tabitha. I'll have one of the children carry what remains back, though we never have any remains after a meal. Once she was back at the house, Tabitha was given her instructions for the afternoon. 10 loaves of bread, and while the bread rose and baked, it was her job to sweep and scrub the floors. The house wasn't huge, but it was big enough she should have been given all day for the task, not just part of an afternoon. Mrs. Matthews must have been angry she didn't offer to do more, but Tabitha knew she'd done the right thing. As much as the idea of marrying a stranger appalled her, she was starting to like the idea of going on an adventure. Sure, she knew the man wouldn't show up, and she'd be left standing alone at the train station, but she could at least see some of the country. Maybe she could go to San Francisco. Or Colorado. She'd heard both were beautiful. As soon as she had finished making the dough and left it to rise, she swept the floors, her mind still on moving west. Where in the west, she didn't know or care at that moment, as long as she was no longer there. Taking care of someone else's cleaning and doing the housework meant for someone else. She wasn't paid enough to do all she did. As soon as the floors were swept, she washed the dust off her hands and checked the bread. It was rising perfectly, so she punched it down, formed it into loaves, and went back to work. She'd have to do the children's floors, and then she could get the bread in the oven. Her day was full, and she was thankful when she was finally finished. It was Saturday, so her work week was over, and she could worship on Sunday. Or sleep. Sleeping sounded better than church, because she was certain her mother would insist on her sitting with Elmer and his children, and she had no desire to get within 10 feet of the man. As she walked back into town to eat supper with Elizabeth and Bernard, her mind was on the type of man she would want to marry. After a day on her hands and knees scrubbing floors, the idea of never having to clean a house again was definitely something she liked. Of course, there were no women alive who didn't have to scrub floors. At the Tandy residence, she ate supper with the couple and their 3 children ate at the table with them, which surprised Tabitha. She'd heard that most rich people had their children eat at a separate table. It didn't bother her that the children ate with them, but it did strike her as odd. While they talked, Elizabeth talked about some of her brides, and how happy they were now that they were out west. Tabitha believed that some people would be happy marrying a stranger, but she didn't believe she was one of them. "I promise, when you see this letter I received yesterday, you're going to want to respond. There's no way you won't want to." "All right," Tabitha said, the skepticism she felt coming across in her voice. Bernard laughed. "She's a hard one to convince, isn't she?" Tabitha had seen Bernard around town, and she knew who he was, but they'd never formally met until that evening. "I've just never had good luck with anything in my life. I'm sure if I agree to do this, I'll be stranded on a train platform in the middle of nowhere, and will have absolutely no money to return, and I'll have to get a job doing just what I'm doing now but with different scenery." Elizabeth smiled and shook her head. "You would simply send me a telegram, and I would send you a ticket to return home. And my telegram would get lost in a pile of telegrams and fed to pigs somewhere." "Pigs don't eat paper," Bernard said. "Only my papers." "We'll make sure everything works out for you," Elizabeth promised. After supper, Bernard set about putting the children to bed, while Elizabeth and Tabitha went to Elizabeth's office. Tabitha took the seat Elizabeth gestured to on the sofa, while Elizabeth sat behind a desk that looked both organized and messy at the same time. Sure enough, Elizabeth knew exactly where what she needed was, and she flipped to a letter, reading it once more before handing it to Tabitha. "I've never seen you with any of the men who have sent me letters before. This man should be yours." Tabitha glanced down at the letter and read through it slowly. "Dear potential wife. My name is Jacob Small, and I live in Lisbon, Wyoming, which is a small town along the border of Wyoming and Colorado. I have a small ranch here that I'm hoping to grow into a much larger operation. I'm interested in marrying a woman who is willing to brave the West with me, helping me to set up a real home where we can raise our children. My parents died a few years back, and I have no family left, unless I can find a bride who is willing to join me. I live a good distance from the nearest train station, and the last part of the journey would have to be made by stagecoach, but if I find the right woman, I promise to be waiting right next to that stagecoach when she arrives. I'm looking for someone in her 20s, who doesn't mind hard work and is willing to help me grow my spread. She needs to want children, and I would be downright tickled if she could cook. I await your reply. Jacob Small." "He does sound like a pleasant man," Tabitha said. "And I like the idea he wants to have children. And he's frank about the fact that I'll need to work once I'm there." Elizabeth couldn't help but note that Tabitha was using the pronoun I when talking about the man. She was going to respond to his letter. "I'll write to him, but we'll see what he says. If he's as kind as his letter makes him sound, then I'm certain he'll be run over by a bull any minute. Make it a brief letter, and we'll send a telegram. That way we can get you on the train before the snow gets too heavy for easy winter travel." It was already mid-September, and though it was still summer, Tabitha knew the other woman was right. She picked up the pencil and paper offered to her, and quickly wrote a response. "When will I know something?" She wanted away from both the Matthews and her mother, who wanted her to marry a pig farmer. Though she had nothing against pig farmers in general, Elmer and his family were filthy people. She did have something against marrying a man who didn't bathe and who didn't make his children bathe. It should only take a few days to get a response. "I'll send Bernard out when we know something." Elizabeth smiled. "I like the idea of you going somewhere you can be happy. Is it so obvious I'm unhappy?" Tabitha had never thought about whether she looked unhappy to others. Knowing life was hard and not showing it took real effort. "Not to everyone, but I can see it. Let's change all that, shall we? I'm not so sure a rancher from Wyoming is going to be able to make me into a happy person so easily. What good is life if you're not willing to try?" Elizabeth asked. "I'll have Bernard take you home." "Thank you." Thinking about everything Elizabeth had said, Tabitha decided to make a real effort not to let her misery show to others. Perhaps if she acted happy, she could become happy. Though that was the hardest thing to do. Chapter 2. Just 3 weeks later, Tabitha found herself standing on the board sidewalk on the side of what could be called a street if one stretched their imagination far enough, in the tiny town of Lisbon, Wyoming. She waited for almost an hour before she stopped the next person walking past, a man in dirty clothes, a crumpled cowboy hat, and boots covered with what she hoped was mud and not something entirely less appealing. And what was less appealing than mud? "Excuse me, sir, but do you know Jacob Small?" she asked. The man took off his hat and slapped it against his leg, for some reason Tabitha simply could not fathom. "Jacob Small? What do you want with that idiot?" "Idiot? I'll have you know I'm here to be Jacob's wife." Tabitha felt the need to defend the man who was about to be her husband, whether she'd met him yet or not. "You kidding me?" the man asked, looking at her as if she'd lost her mind. "How'd he convince you to marry him? You one of those mail-order brides who comes from the East to marry someone you never met? It's the only way he'd ever get a wife." "Well, yes, but he was supposed to be here to meet me." The man stood staring at her for a moment, and then he simply started laughing. "Jacob Small is a squatter. He lives down by the river, and he has no home. Just lives out in the open. He herds pigs around like they're sheep, but he calls them cattle. I've never seen a man who was more deranged than Jacob." He laughed a little more. "Now, if you want, I can take you to meet him." "No, thank you." Tabitha raised her chin and met his gaze head-on. "Why would you laugh so much at another person's misfortune, Mr. Blander?" "Bert Blander." He still looked as if he was ready to start laughing again, so Tabitha did something terribly out of character for her, but necessary for her feelings at that moment. She kicked him. Hard. "You got my cowboy boot, girl. You didn't hurt me." Tabitha was so angry with him, both for laughing at her and for being the bearer of news that her future husband wasn't sane, that she wanted to cry. She raised her foot to kick him again, and this time aimed higher, smiling when he shouted in pain when she hit his knee. "Now what am I supposed to do?" Bert stared at the girl for a moment, wanting to help her, despite the fact that she'd kicked him twice. He watched as she sat down on a bench looking despondent. Instead of going on about his business, which is the thing he knew he should do, he took the seat beside her. There was a trunk in front of her and a carpet bag in her hand. "Look, lady. I'm Tabitha Murphy." She was mortified to see a tear fall onto her hand, and she kept her face down so he wouldn't see her cry. "Nice to meet you, Miss Murphy. Now I'm not sure if there's another man in town looking for a bride, but I suppose you could stay with me tonight, and I'll introduce you around at church tomorrow." "I couldn't spend the night with you." "What kind of woman do you think I am?" "I have no idea at all what kind of woman you are. I do have a live-in housekeeper who is married to my ranch foreman, and they will act as chaperones, if that's what you want." "They will?" Tabitha peeked up at him, and he saw the tears shining in her beautiful blue eyes, and more tears clinging to her eyelashes. "They sure will. Do you want to come home with me, and we'll make sure you don't marry an idiot or a man who isn't quite right with the world?" She smiled at how he categorized Jacob Small. It was better than calling the man an idiot. "You don't mind?" "I don't mind. Just don't kick me again." "Then don't deserve it again." He sighed. "I'll have to come back in for your trunk. I rode my horse into town." She frowned. "I suppose I'll have to stay with it then. I'm going to the store. I'll be back in a few minutes." While he was gone, Tabitha could do nothing but fret about her future. She wondered who had sent the telegrams to her, because the person hadn't sounded insane, but he must be. She was thankful Mr. Blander was taking her home with him, and she wouldn't have to sleep in someone's barn or something, but still. She couldn't count on a stranger to keep her forever, or for even longer than one day. She worried she would end up having to go home with her tail between her legs and beg for her job with the Matthews back, even though she had no desire to work for them again. She didn't even want to live with her mother again. Perhaps there was a seamstress in town who needed another pair of hands. Or maybe she could work at the store. That could work. But then where would she live? Oh, why had she gone against her instincts and gone to marry a stranger? It made no sense when she knew she was the unluckiest person alive. When Mr. Blander came back to her, he said, "The store is going to deliver your trunk along with my purchases. Let's go." She stood up and walked with him, carrying her carpet bag. He stopped in front of a horse and asked if she needed help up. "Where will you ride?" she asked. "Look, lady, I didn't bring my wagon or buggy into town. If you're waiting for a special ride, talk to the merchant. I think he would let you ride out with his son." Tabitha wrestled with her decision for a moment, but decided she'd rather ride with the devil she knew instead of the one she didn't. "Yes, I need help up." She'd been on a horse before, of course, but it had been mostly on her father's land. Never had she done any riding around others, because her mother had said she needed to ride with a side saddle if she was going to be seen by people outside her family. Bert mounted the horse and told her to step on his foot as he reached a hand down to help her up. She did as she was told and found she needed to hike her skirt up a little and ride astride, keeping her arms tightly around him. She said a silent prayer that no one would see them, and she hung on tight, certain she would fall if she didn't. Bert was annoyed by how slowly he needed to ride back to the ranch. They were doing their best to get everything ready for winter, but he'd run out of barbed wire, and the cattle didn't like to stay in one place without it. Thankfully, Jim, the store owner, had anticipated at least one of the ranchers in the area would have that problem, and he had some in stock. When they pulled up to the ranch house, Tabitha gaped at it in surprise. It was huge. The man she'd taken for a run-of-the-mill cowboy who slept in a bunkhouse with other men, instead owned a beautiful home and apparently a nice-sized ranch. He stopped and helped Tabitha down. He wrestled with whether or not to get straight back to work, and have Tabitha introduce herself to Alice, or whether he should go in with her, and finally he decided to do the polite thing and go inside with her. "I'll introduce you to my housekeeper, and then I'll get back to work." He strode toward the door, not even offering to carry her carpet bag. Tabitha thought he was the poorest-mannered man she'd ever met, but there was nothing much she could do about it. Once inside the house, he bellowed out, "Alice." An older woman, around 50 or so, hurried into the room, wiping her hands on an apron. "Yes, Mr. Blander?" "Alice Duncan, meet Tabitha Murphy." "Tabitha came here to marry someone who did not collect her from the stagecoach, so I'm going to introduce her around at church tomorrow morning. She's staying here until then." Tabitha turned to thank him for his hospitality, but he was already out the door. "Is he the rudest man alive, or am I imagining things?" she asked Mrs. Duncan. "He's certainly not the politest man I've ever met, and I won't go any further than that." Mrs. Duncan grinned at her. "Let me show you to your bedroom. You'll be upstairs with George and me. Thank you so much for helping me. If I can be of any help with supper or anything else, you just let me know." "Thank you, but I can manage things. I'm sure you're tired after traveling. Would you like me to draw you a bath?" "I would like that very much. I feel like I have 5 days of grime covering me, and I'm not sure I'm very far off from that. A bath would make me the happiest woman alive." "You should set your cap for Bert," Mrs. Duncan said, surprising her. "He had a fiancée who ran off with some idiot, and decided marriage just wasn't for him. That's sad. I don't think I could marry such a rude man though. I've already kicked him. Twice." Mrs. Duncan threw back her head and laughed. "And that's just why you should marry him. He's used to everyone treating him as if he's the king of the valley, but that's very inaccurate. He needs a woman who can stand up to him." "He probably does, but does he want a woman who can stand up to him?" Of course, he does. He may not know it yet, but he does. Mrs. Duncan turned to leave the room. The bathroom is at the end of the hall. I'll start the water. You have a bathroom? I've seen them, of course, but I never dreamed I would live in a home with one. Of course, I don't live here, but I'm staying here tonight, and I can pretend. And you should pretend. Oh, you're going to give old Bert a run for his money. Old? Tabitha asked. Mrs. Duncan was clearly much older than Mr. Blander. He's acted like an old man since the day he was born. My husband and I worked for his parents before we worked for him. She died when he was still just 16, and his father died when he was 24. He's alone in the world now. Well, we're here with him, but he has no family. He's not the kind of man to really talk about his troubles, so I fear he's living a very lonely life. That's sad, Tabitha said, surprised she cared at all that the rude man she'd met was alone. She did, though. For whatever reason. Mrs. Duncan started the bath, and Tabitha watched how it worked, so she could do it herself. Thank you for all your help, she told Mrs. Duncan. After your bath, come downstairs and we'll chat some more. If you don't need a nap, that is. Not as much as I need to be clean and need to learn about the men around here. I'll be down. Tabitha closed the door to the bathroom and stripped as quickly as she could. The knowledge she would soon be soaking in a tub spurred her on. She was stiff, dirty, and sore, and she hoped a real bath would help all three things. She got out of the tub an hour later, feeling much cleaner and just a bit wrinkled. She wrapped a towel around herself and hurried into her bedroom, pleased she didn't meet anyone along the way. Once she was dressed with her hair brushed dry, she went down the stairs into the kitchen. You look much better, Mrs. Duncan told her. I feel much better, Tabitha agreed. I wasn't sure I'd be able to force myself to get out, but the water was getting cold. I wait to bathe until my husband and Mr. Blander are out for the day, so I can take as long as I like to soak. I've spent countless hours in that bathtub. I think it's my favorite place on God's green earth. I don't blame you. Tabitha shook her head. I did truly enjoy that bath. Mrs. Duncan looked at Tabitha. So Mr. Blander is going to introduce you to our bachelors at church tomorrow? What are you looking for in a husband? Tabitha shrugged. I'm looking for a man who has a roof over his head, and I don't want to marry a man who lives in a bunkhouse. Well, that disqualifies 90% of the men in town. What about appearance? That doesn't matter much to me, Tabitha responded, but as she did, she couldn't stop thinking about the way Mr. Blander's hair had curled around his cowboy hat. Sure, it meant he needed a haircut, but he was a mighty handsome man. All right. Do you care what they do for a living? Tabitha shook her head. I expected to marry a man who I would have to work alongside, and I'm still willing to do so. There are a few men in town who are starting their own spreads. I'm certain Mr. Blander will introduce you. Mrs. Duncan put the bread pans into the oven and walked over to sit at the table with Tabitha. You'll have the best life with Mr. Blander. I know he's rude. He's not perfect. But he's a very good man, and he's lonely. Tabitha bit her lip. He's not shown any kind of interest in me. I'll encourage him to take you for a walk after supper. That'll help things along. I'm not certain that's a good idea. I am. You were taught to listen to your elders, right? Tabitha's lips quirked into a smile as she nodded. Yes. Well, then listen to me. This is the smartest thing you can possibly do in this situation. Tabitha was skeptical, but she nodded slowly. If you say so. I do say so. I'll shout it from the rooftops if I have to. Let me help you cook then. Tabitha still wasn't certain she even wanted to give Mr. Blander a chance to get to know her, but she did know she needed to marry someone. Going home to Beckham was not an option. Chapter 3. When Bert walked into the house that evening for supper, he was still thinking about Tabitha Murphy. Why would a woman be willing to leave behind everything she knew to marry an absolute stranger? It just didn't make any kind of sense to him. The dining table was set, which surprised him. He usually ate in the kitchen with George and Mrs. Duncan. "Why are we eating in the dining room?" he asked as he washed his hands at the kitchen sink. Mrs. Duncan poked Bert in the chest, which wasn't a huge surprise. She didn't act like a housekeeper with him. "You're eating in the dining room with your guest. I've spent half the day with her, and I promise you, there is not a woman alive who is better suited to you. You're going to take her for a walk after supper, and you are going to beg her to forgive your rudeness and be your wife. You hear me?" Bert frowned. Mrs. Duncan had been a second mother to him growing up, and he wasn't about to upset her. He knew she had his best interests in mind. "I don't see how I can do that. I will bring in her chest after supper though. Robert Bartholomew Blander, you are a blind man. You can't see that an attractive woman has come from the East to get married. She may be the only woman in the entire state of Wyoming who can stand up to you. Why wouldn't you take the chance to marry her?" Bert sighed. "You stand up to me quite well," he said, wishing, not for the first time, that she would remember she was the housekeeper and not his mother. "I guess I can walk with her, but don't get your hopes up. She doesn't like me any more than I like her." Mrs. Duncan shook her head. "And why can't you just be nice to people? You see a girl sitting on a bench in town, and you make fun of her for coming here to marry a stranger? You should have better manners than that. Your mother and I did our best to pound them into your head. But I'm the thickest-headed man alive." "I know. I know." "Well, I'm surprised to hear you admit that," Tabitha said from behind him. Bert slowly turned. "I'm sorry I was rude. I was taught better. Would you walk with me after supper?" Tabitha laughed softly. "Are you afraid of your housekeeper, Mr. Blander?" "Of course, I am. I'm not senile." Mrs. Duncan shook her head. "Get to the table, and I'll start serving supper." Bert did as he was told, noting that Tabitha was following behind him. "Why did you have to get me in trouble?" "I didn't realize I would. She asked how we met, so I told her. How did I know she was going to treat you like a child?" He sighed. "She was there for my birth. I've always seen her as more of a second mother than a housekeeper." Tabitha was surprised at how natural their conversation was after their terrible beginning. "No siblings?" He shook his head. "No. Ma said she'd always hoped for more, and it just never happened. My mother said she took one look at me and never let my father touch her again. She wasn't particularly fond of me, and cheered when I said I was coming west to marry a stranger. She was just never, well, warm and affectionate. You should have met my mother. She would have opened her arms and taken you in, wanting you to live with us forever. It's just how she was." Tabitha smiled. "It sounds like you miss her a lot." "I do. And my father as well, but he wasn't as warm and affectionate as Ma. He was more the type to work hard for his family and expect everyone else to toe the line." "I understand. My father was more affectionate than my mother, but they were really both quite distant. I worked for a family back east, and we didn't need the extra money, but Mother didn't want me underfoot all day, so I worked for them." "What did you do?" he asked, taking a piece of bread and buttering it. "I cooked, cleaned, minded their children, ran errands, worked in their garden. Basically, I did what I was told for 10 hours every day for 20 cents per day, and my mother was happy to be rid of me." 20 cents per day? Can I hire you to help Mrs. Duncan for that? I promise I wouldn't work you half as hard." She shook her head. "No, I came here to marry. Mrs. Duncan was telling me about some of the eligible bachelors in town. Though none of them sounded good to her at all. And now that she was looking at Bert again, he didn't look half as quarrelsome. Bert frowned, a line appearing between his eyebrows. Is that so? Tabitha nodded. Yes, it's hard to know what I want to do though. Mrs. Duncan thinks I should marry you and not let the other men have a chance. She told me pretty much the same thing all day long. He shook his head. That woman gets something in her head and nothing else will do. Do you know how long I'll hear what an idiot I am if I don't marry you and you marry someone else in town? She laughed. Well, I've decided she's my friend, and if I don't marry you, expect me to be here often, visiting her. The idea of her being married to someone else and visiting at his place, seeing her expecting someone else's baby, it wasn't something he wanted to think about. We'll walk after supper and talk. Maybe she's right. He would think she wanted to marry him for his money, but she'd come there planning to work alongside her husband, not to be cared for. I'd like that. Now that she was seeing him in a different light, and he wasn't being rude to her constantly, she thought maybe a marriage between them could work. I won't be the most obedient wife in the world. If that's what you're looking for, you need to forget all about me. I used to think it was what I was looking for. Now I'm not so certain. After supper, he took her for a walk, having her get a shawl so she wouldn't get cold. She hugged it about her shoulders as she walked with him out across the ranch into a grove of trees. My mother loved applesauce. The year they married, Pa planted these apple trees, so she could always make as much as she wanted. They were Ma's job, though, and she was the one who picked the apples, and she and Mrs. Duncan would make the sauce together. I bet you have very fond memories of her and her applesauce. I do. Do you like applesauce? She nodded. But only with cinnamon. She stumbled over a small hole, and he offered his arm to steady her. It's only good with cinnamon, he said, smiling at her. So you cook? I do. It's the only household chore that I really enjoy, to be honest. I do them all, and will until the day I die, I'm sure, but being in a kitchen makes me happy. She grinned. My mother hated to cook, so she showed me the basics, and it was my job to cook for the family from the time I was 9. He shook his head. You don't want to have to go back there, do you? I won't go back there. I'll work here for some money and take the train to the next stop and the next if I have to. I will not go back to my parents' house. She sighed. I make it sound like life was horrible there, but it wasn't. I'm ready to be married and start having children. I always wanted to have at least a dozen, but I'm getting to the point where I won't be able to have that many if I get much older. I'm already 22. That's not old at all. She shrugged. Everyone back home thought I was much too old to be unmarried. He stopped walking and turned to her. May I kiss you? She was surprised he asked. He seemed like the type to just grab a woman and kiss her silly. Why? He smiled. I want to see if we're compatible, and that's the best way to tell. And if you don't like kissing me? Then I'll give you the money for a few more train stops, so you can see if you can find a man who will suit you better. She thought about it for a moment and then nodded. All right. I'll give that a chance then. He put his hands on either side of her waist and pulled her toward him. She'd expected a light peck on the lips, but instead, he tucked her body into his, leaned down, and kissed her with a passion she had never imagined. His lips toyed with hers, and his tongue slipped into her mouth. She hadn't realized a man would use his tongue when kissing, but she liked it, so she stood on tiptoe to get even closer to him, and she bravely moved her tongue into his mouth, which seemed to surprise him. They stood joined together that way for a long while, his hands moving over her back, caressing every inch of her. When one hand moved down to her backside, she knew she needed to stop him, though she had no desire to do so. She wanted to spend the rest of her life right there in the middle of the apple trees with him. She removed his hand from where it had roamed and took a step back, her chest heaving. Never in her life had she imagined a kiss could be so much. It was everything she'd thought about when she'd thought about how babies were made. She knew there was more, but she'd never let herself think about that. After a moment of just staring at each other in the darkness, she asked, "Are we compatible?" He smiled. "We're more than compatible. Marry me." Tabitha stood there with her hand on her mouth that still burned from his kisses. "Yes, I'll marry you. We'll have the preacher marry us after church in the morning." He wrapped an arm around her as they walked back toward the house. "I would have Mrs. Duncan stay home from church to move your things down to my room, but I think it would be best if she went with us. Everyone needs to know we slept in different beds for the one night you were here. And I need my trunk carried in," she said. "I'll move my own things after we get home tomorrow. There's not much upstairs, and if my trunk is moved into your room, I can get what I need from it tonight, and just leave it down there." "That sounds wonderful. I hope you know there will be no separate beds. I want babies. I couldn't accept separate beds." The short walk back to the house was spent in silence as she thought about what it would mean to have Bert's hands move over her with no clothing on. One of her married friends had described the entire mating process to her, and although it hadn't sounded pleasant at the time, now it sounded downright exciting. After the trunk was brought inside the house, Bert excused himself to go and take a bath, while Tabitha and Mrs. Duncan went through her clothes, decided what she'd wear for the wedding, and unpacked most of her things. "Tomorrow should just be a matter of moving a few things down," Tabitha said. "I'm glad you're marrying my Bert," Mrs. Duncan told her. "I knew the moment I saw you that you needed to marry him." Tabitha smiled at the older woman. "I feel like I'm doing the best thing. Bert kissed me, and my whole body felt like it was on fire. Then he's the right man for you. That's how my George made me feel the first time we kissed back in school. He would chase me around at recess, and when he caught me, the kisses came right after. I only ran because I knew he would catch me, and we'd kiss. Oh, I miss those days." Tabitha laughed. "Well, I'm not sure if I'll be running from Bert or not, but the kisses sure are nice. I'm surprised you let him kiss you. He told me it was the only way to know if we were truly compatible, and if we weren't after a kiss, then he would give me money to go further west on the train, so I could find someone I did want to marry. It seemed like it would be good for me either way. I'd have kissed him too." Mrs. Duncan shook her head. "I'm used to doing everything around the house, so you let me know if you want me to keep doing that, or if I should let you do some of the work as well. I love to cook, so I'd love to take that over, if you don't mind. Cook and bake both, actually." "That sounds nice. I'd be happy to give up those chores." "Did you make applesauce already?" Tabitha asked. "He talked to you about his mother's grove of apple trees and her love for applesauce, didn't he?" "He did. If you haven't already made it for this year, I'd love to do it with you. I like to add a lot of cinnamon to mine, and it sounds like that's how Bert prefers it as well." "Oh, it is. I use less than his mother did, but he still likes it." "Well, perhaps we'll blend my receipt and hers, and we'll have a new type of applesauce we'll all love. I told him I'd take care of the apple trees." "We'll do it together," Mrs. Duncan said. "Sounds good to me. I look forward to having you beside me as I navigate newlywed life. Perhaps you can teach me little things I don't know yet." "I would love to teach you everything I know." Bert came in then, and they left him alone in his room. Tabitha felt odd just being in there with him before they were married, even with Mrs. Duncan there. Oh, marriage to Bert would be wonderful. She just hoped she wouldn't have to kick him very often. Bert watched her go, still thinking of the kiss they shared. Marrying a woman with the kind of passion Tabitha had was something he'd always dreamed about. And now it was going to happen. Chapter 4. Bert drove the buggy to church the following morning instead of riding his horse as usual. He couldn't stop sneaking glances at Tabitha, amazed at how much different she looked than when he'd first seen her beside the stagecoach depot. Her white blouse was such a contrast to her dark hair, and her forest green skirt cinched in at the waist, making him remember how it felt to have his hands on her the night before. He couldn't believe he was marrying a woman who was all but a stranger, but if their kiss the night before was any indication, he had made the right decision. When they reached town, he caught her by her slim waist and helped her down from the buggy. "I cannot wait until our wedding night," he whispered, his lips all but touching her ear. She grinned up at him. "I have a feeling I'm going to enjoy it as much as you do." "I sure hope so. I'm going to try my best to make sure it's an experience neither of us will ever forget." His arm was around her waist as he guided her into the church. It was both the local school and church, and not exactly what she was used to in the way of a church. Though Tabitha had gone to the country school south of Beckham, they had always made the drive into town for the real church, as her mother had called it. She'd always refused to go to the country church. Right behind them were George and Alice Duncan, ready to vouch for them that they'd stayed on separate floors of the house the night before. Alice stood with Tabitha and introduced her to different ladies of the church as Bert's fiancée. Bert had gone to the front of the church to talk to the pastor, asking him to perform the ceremony after church. When Bert came back to Tabitha, he said, "Pastor Monahan wants to perform the ceremony before our church service. Is that all right with you?" Tabitha nodded. "Sure." Then she could write to her mother and tell her she'd had the big ceremony her mother had always said her child should have for her wedding. She was only sorry there wasn't a photographer there. Tabitha waited with Alice, speaking with her in low tones about different things they would be doing that week, like making applesauce. Bert came to Tabitha a few minutes later, took her hand, and led her to the front of the church, where they stood in front of the pastor, whose voice boomed out over the congregation. "Dearly beloved, we're here today to join Bert and, what's your name, child?" "Tabitha." "Bert and Tabitha in the rites of holy matrimony. Anyone got anything against them marrying?" When no one spoke up, the pastor continued. "All right, let's get on with it then." The rest of the ceremony went quickly. They spoke their vows, and then, to Tabitha's surprise, Pastor Monahan said, "Okay, you're husband and wife. Now we want to see a big kiss that tells us this marriage is going to be for real. Kiss her, Bert." Tabitha's eyes widened, and she looked at the pastor as if he'd lost his mind. Bert seemed to be expecting it though, and he turned her toward him, moved his arms around her, and he kissed her with the same passion he had the night before. Even though she knew there was an audience, she reacted to his kiss the same way she had the night before. She went up on her tiptoes to get closer to him, and wrapped her arms around him. She didn't know how much time passed while they were locked in their embrace, but finally the pastor cleared his throat, reminding them both they had an audience for their passion. The pastor shook his head. "That was not a church kiss. This is a place of worship." Tabitha's face was beet red as they took their seats for the church service. And wouldn't you know? The entire sermon was on wives obeying their husbands. Tabitha knew she would never be a meek and obedient wife, and she tried to think whether she'd told Bert that the night before, but as then, her mind was clouded with passion, and she couldn't remember. She would just have to tell him on the way home, so she could make sure that he knew. She wasn't going to pretend to be meek and obedient when it wasn't something she believed in at all. She squirmed in her seat, bumping into Bert repeatedly, not at all comfortable with the sermon. Perhaps it was the right way to do things, but she refused to agree to follow whatever a man told her to do. She didn't know him well enough for one thing. And for another, well, she wasn't feeling obedience when she looked at him. She'd listen to his views, and try to do what he wanted, but if she felt his views were wrong, she wouldn't obey. It was that simple. Tabitha was thrilled when church was finally over, and she planned to tell Bert exactly what she thought on the drive home. She couldn't wait to get out of the church, but there was a line of people there waiting to meet her. One woman stuck out to her. I'm Gladys Sinclair. It's so good to meet you. Gladys was pretty, but very soft-spoken. Hi. I'm Tabitha. I'm your closest neighbor. I'd love it if you'd come over for tea one day this week. It will be nice to have a neighbor close to my age. Gladys held a child of around 3 in her arms. I'd like that. Maybe late in the week? Alice and I are going to make and can applesauce early this week. How about Friday? Bring Alice with you. I adore her. All right. We'll be there. What time? Let's say 2 in the afternoon. That's this one's nap time, and it will be so much easier if she's sleeping. The little girl took the 2 fingers she had in her mouth out. I have tea. Maybe tomorrow, Gladys said to her daughter. 2 sounds fine to me, Tabitha said. Wonderful. I'll see you then. Gladys moved out of the way, and another woman was there, wanting to talk to her. As they walked out of the church together sometime later, Tabitha said, I think I met every woman in the entire state of Wyoming. There was a line. What did they all want with me? They wanted to welcome you to the community. He wasn't willing to tell her the truth though. As the wealthiest man in the entire area, people would want to be her friend, hoping for donations to their favorite causes. In some cases, those causes were themselves. On the drive home, she remembered she needed to talk to him about obedience and marriage. I need you to understand that I'm not the type of woman to be blindly obedient to you. I have a mind that I like to use, and I'll listen to your opinions, and I'll make my own decisions. That whole sermon today had me feeling like I was going to be the worst wife alive. She stole a glance in his direction and saw he was laughing. What's so funny? She asked, upset that he wasn't taking her seriously. I knew you wouldn't be an obedient wife when you kicked me in town. I can't believe you felt the need to tell me you wouldn't be obedient. I can see that on my own. I feel like kicking you again now, she said, frowning at him. I'm sure you do, but there's one rule in my buggy. Don't kick the driver. You just made up that rule, she said, glaring now. Well, it's a good rule to have. Will you be obedient to the no kicking the driver rule, dear wife? Bert's lips were still quivering with amusement. Yes, it's a rule that makes sense. I wouldn't want you driving off the road or anything. I'll reserve my kicks for when we're not in a moving vehicle. Tabitha hid her grin by looking out the other way, knowing he wouldn't see her face. Does that mean that if you get mad at me while I'm driving, you won't kick me ever? Or that you won't kick me until the buggy stops? I guess we'll find out, won't we? He groaned. I married a woman who is not sweet, threatens me, and flat out refuses to be obedient. What was I thinking? If the buggy wasn't moving, I'd kiss you and remind you. He chuckled. Now that's a threat I hope you'll carry out when we get home. She laughed, briefly resting her head on his shoulder. I'll do my best to remember. Sometimes these things just seep out of my brain. I need to talk to you about a conversation I had with George this morning. He has asked that he be allowed to use the foreman's cabin as he did when my parents were alive. It wasn't until after Ma died that they moved into the house, so Alice could take care of things easier. But with you there, and willing to do the cooking, she won't need to be there as many hours. Would that bother you? She nodded. I think that's perfect. I like the idea of the house being a little more private than it would be with them living there. I mean, I know they'll be in and out certain hours, but it'll be better than the way it is now. If I want to sit on your lap in the parlor and kiss you, I wouldn't feel comfortable doing it with Alice and George around. He smiled. I like the idea of you sitting on my lap and kissing me. I don't care if it's in the parlor or in the dining room. I have a feeling we're going to enjoy each other a great deal, she said softly. It will be nice to be alone and know when the Duncans will be around. His arm wrapped around her, and he kissed her forehead. I'm sure Alice is making us a nice lunch, but maybe we can say you're making supper after, so they can make themselves scarce. Oh, you're not thinking we'll have our wedding night after lunch, are you? It's called a wedding night for a reason, I'm sure. He chuckled. I'm not sure I can wait until it's actually night. Not if you keep talking about kissing and sitting on my lap. Maybe I can go with Alice to the foreman's cabin and help her get it cleaned up. It must be a mess after years of sitting idle. He shook his head. Alice goes up there for a couple hours every week to make sure it's clean, in case we have visitors. Their son brings his family at least once a month or so. Oh, that's nice. They'll be happy to have the cabin then. It's actually more of a house than a cabin, he said. There are 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a parlor. What else would someone want? That sounds nice. And your father built that for them? He shook his head. That's the cabin my grandfather built when they first came west on the Oregon Trail. They lived in it until this house was built in 1861. That makes sense, she said. It would take an exceptional man to build a nice house like that for employees. My father and grandfather were both exceptional men, but the house was already there. Father hired George and Alice about 5 years before I was born. And they moved in there then? He nodded. They've always seen that as their real home, and they're excited to move back into it. Well, I can't say I'm disappointed. He stopped the buggy in front of the house, before walking around to catch her by the waist and lift her down. He held her close and let her slide down the front of his body. I wish they would leave now, he said softly. She smiled. It'll happen soon enough. 10 minutes ago isn't soon enough for me. They walked into the house and saw that their meal was on the dining room table, along with a cake. As soon as they walked in, Alice popped in from the kitchen. I've done all the dishes except the ones you're about to eat from. Do you want me to stay and do those dishes as well? Tabitha smiled. I think I can do some dishes. It won't hurt me a bit. Then I'll be off. There should be enough food there for your supper as well, and I'll be back in the morning to get you anything else you need, Alice promised. Perfect. Thank you so much for making the day easy for us. Bert grinned. Do you think I could talk George into unhitching the horses and putting them up for the night? Alice laughed. He's working on it now. Tabitha understood then why the older couple had left church a few minutes early and left her to deal with the line of women alone. They were making their wedding day as private and free from work as they possibly could. They ate as Alice gathered a few things and left the house. That was very kind of them to make our day so easy for us. Tabitha cut off a piece of the roast beef. And private. Don't forget private. She smiled. Oh, I suppose we should pray rather than just eating. I can't believe we almost forgot. We need God in our marriage. They bowed their heads and he prayed for them, asking God to help them with their marriage and help them to get along together. As soon as they were finished eating, Tabitha put the food that was left into the icebox and washed the dishes. Bert sat at the kitchen table, frowning at her. That could wait, couldn't it? No, it can't. The food would get caked onto the plates, and it would take twice as long later. I'll just get it done now, and we won't have to think about it again. Tabitha enjoyed seeing him so anxious for their first night together, or day it would seem. Maybe there was a chance they would fall in love and not simply enjoy being together. She'd like that a lot. He sighed, watching her as she worked. How can I make this faster? He asked. Do you want to wipe the dishes dry and put them away? She asked. No. Then just sit there. It'll only take a minute or two. Fine. Chapter 5. As soon as Tabitha put the last plate away, Bert was on his feet. He took her hand and pulled her toward the bedroom. Let me at least get my apron off, she protested. He paused long enough for her to take it off and toss it to the table before resuming their short walk to the bedroom. He shut the door behind them, just in case the Duncans had forgotten something. As soon as the door was closed, he pulled her to him and kissed her until she was unsteady on her feet. When one of his hands cupped her breast, she moaned softly, enjoying his touch. "All right, turn around, and we'll get this thing off you." Her blouse buttoned in the back, and he immediately began liberating each button from its hole. He frowned at the corset he discovered. "You don't have to wear this contraption for me," he said. "My corset?" she asked. "Yes. They don't seem like they're healthful for women." She shrugged. "I haven't left my house without one for many years." "That's fair. Wear one when you go out, but not at home. It just doesn't seem like it would be good for you. My mother always told me I'd get so thick no man would ever look at me if I didn't wear one all the time. So I wear one. But no more, right?" She turned in his arms, not thinking about the fact that her blouse was gone, and she'd be standing there in just her skirt and corset with her breasts pushed up by the garment. "Is it that important to you?" she asked. He nodded. "I've just never had a use for them. They don't look at all comfortable." "They don't feel comfortable either," she said. "All right. I'll only wear one when I leave the house." "Thank you," he said, leaning down and licking the soft flesh that was pushed up by her corset. "Now turn back around, so I can get this thing off you." He made short work of her corset, making her think he'd dealt with many in the past. "Do you have experience with corsets?" she asked. "Of course not," he said, but she had no idea if he was telling the truth or not. Didn't most men have experience with women before they married? When her corset was gone, she wore her petticoat beneath it. "How many layers of clothes do you have on?" "As many as it takes to be modest." "Stop complaining. You want a modest wife, don't you?" "Not particularly. I mean, I don't want you giving a show to all the men in town, but you're my wife. I want you naked as much as possible. I'm not going to run around the house naked. I need to be wearing at least an apron." He chuckled. "I think Alice would have a heart attack if she saw you that way." "Maybe." He unfastened her skirt and pushed it down, then pulled her petticoat off. At last she stood naked before him, other than her knickers, which he happily pushed off for her. "You're beautiful, wife. You're clothed, husband." She went to work on his tie, and then unbuttoned his shirt. He took so long to undress her it felt as if hours had passed, and though she knew that wasn't true, she wanted him undressed faster than he seemed capable of doing things. As soon as his shirt was off, she moved to the buttons on his pants. She was as ready to have him undressed as he was to have her naked. Some of it was that she was aching to find out what making love was like, but also she was curious as to what he looked like without his clothes. She'd seen naked babies, more than her share after working for the Matthews for 4 years, but she'd never seen a man naked. Once she'd seen a painting that was a statue of a man, but her mother had covered her eyes. She hadn't had time to really study him there. And while she knew the basics of lovemaking, she had no idea what it would actually be like and feel like. And her curiosity was about to get the better of her. She'd tried to ask her mother a couple of questions before leaving, but her mother had told her the best way to learn was to submit to her husband and allow him his rights. That hadn't helped at all. When he was completely naked, she took a step back to gaze at him. Her eyes locked onto his member, and she stared at it for a moment, finally stating what she thought was completely obvious. "Baby boys are much smaller there." He chuckled. "They grow as a boy grows up." "I see that. Is it soft?" "You're welcome to touch it and see for yourself." Tabitha didn't need another invitation. She reached out and touched him with one finger. "Oh, it's soft. Feels like velvet." She stroked it with her whole hand. "It's hard underneath the velvet though." Very strange. He caught her hand and took it off him. If you keep doing that, we're never going to be able to finish what we started. She didn't understand that, but it was fine. Instead, she floated into his arms and wrapped her own arms around him. Show me. Bert didn't have to be asked twice. Or told twice, as the case may be. He lifted her and laid her on one side of the bed. In a moment, he was in beside her, and his hands were stroking her everywhere. When one hand went between her thighs and stroked the secret flesh nestled there, she gasped and caught his wrist. That felt too good for it to be all right. You shouldn't do that. Why not? He asked. It feels good. Really good. That can't be all right. Wasn't there something in the Bible that said if it feels good, don't do it? She knew it was there somewhere. It's fine. I promise. It feels just as good to me when you touch me. But, are you sure that's all right? He stroked her again, causing her to arch into his hand. Positive. He covered her lips with his own so she couldn't protest anymore, not that her protests were real. She was obviously enjoying herself more than expected. A short while later, they lay beside each other on the bed, each of them breathing heavily. Can we do that every day? She finally asked. We will do that as often as possible. He pulled her to him and held her tightly. You really enjoyed it, didn't you? Yes. My whole body aches from it, but, wow. I didn't expect to see a rainbow. He chuckled. A rainbow? Everything turned into a rainbow at the end. It was the most glorious experience of my life. Then we'll do it often. And it's okay that I liked it so much? Yes, it's very okay that you liked it. I think I liked it more than you did. As Bert spoke, his hands moved over her continually. He couldn't believe the feisty woman beside him was really his wife. She was perfect in every way. She leaned over him, kissing him. So how shall we spend the rest of the day? He chuckled. Well, I don't know. I usually read the paper after church on Sundays. If you enjoy reading, many of my mother's books are on the shelf in the parlor. Her eyes widened. You wouldn't think I was frittering my time away if I read something? Of course not. It doesn't matter what you read. It's all good for your mind. Then I will happily read a book while you read the paper. She'd been taught that reading when you could be doing something more productive was bad for the mind. Not by a teacher, of course, but by her mother. She jumped out of bed and pulled a nightgown over her head. There's no point in dressing if we're not leaving the house today, she announced. Maybe not, he said. He pulled an old pair of faded Levi's on and left his shirt off. Why dress if she wasn't going to? In the parlor, he showed her which books had been his mother's, and she chose one she'd heard about but never read. She'd sneaked and read her teacher's copy of Little Women by Louisa May Alcott at school during recess, but she'd never been allowed to read Little Men. Now she had the chance. She sat down on the couch, tucking her feet under her to one side, and she lost herself in the book. She was delighted to discover the characters had some carryovers from Little Women. She didn't notice when Bert stood up to turn on the light. She didn't even notice when he put the paper down and watched her for a few minutes. Finally, she noticed when he asked, "Are you getting hungry?" She looked at the book, and she realized she'd read the first 200 pages. No wonder her mother didn't think she should read books. She spent all day and didn't notice time passing around her. I'll reheat supper. Sorry, I completely forgot that the world was going on without us. What book are you reading? He asked. When she told him, he smiled. That was a favorite of mine. Little Women was good, but I really preferred Little Men. He followed her into the kitchen and watched as she put supper on the table. Do you mind eating in here? She asked. I can put everything on the table in the dining room as well, but the kitchen seems so cozy. No, this is fine. I always ate in the kitchen with the Duncans. I don't know why she set the dining table yesterday. Because she was hoping you'd marry me, Tabitha told him. That's why she had you take me for a walk after supper as well. She was hoping that you'd spend a little time with me and realize that we were meant to be together. She asked me to agree and have an open mind. He nodded, smiling. I should have known. She was really excited about me marrying you. She told me there's no one else in the area that you would consider, and she was ready for you to settle down and be happy. I don't know if I can say that the way you make me feel calms me at all. Or settles me. He reached for her hand as he said a prayer over their food. I think all you do is get me excited. She smiled. Just as you get me excited. She brushed his bare foot with her own under the table. You need to stop that if you want to make it through supper, he said, taking a bite of the warmed food. Thankfully, it was just as delicious the second time. She giggled. We're going to make an applesauce this week. I'd love that, he said. I will look forward to having applesauce again. I ate too much of it when I had the flu last winter, and we've been out for a good long while. The store in town doesn't have applesauce, she asked. Well, they do, but it certainly doesn't taste like my mother's. To be fair, neither did Alice's, but hers is still good. We're going to combine my receipt with your mother's. It should be delicious. I can't believe you're going to change my mother's receipt. If it's not as good, I'm going to have something to say about it. I'll make sure it's still delicious. Bert studied her. If it's not as good, will you make one kind for me and one kind for you? If it's not as good, we will. But I want you to give it a real try, and not just say it's not good enough. I will. I wouldn't want to upset my wife now, would I? Probably not, Tabitha said. I think you want to keep me happy. If only to avoid getting kicked again. Why did the pastor tell us to kiss the way we did, and then scold us for doing it? Bert shook his head. He always tells couples to do that, and then everyone laughs when the couple is too embarrassed. I think he expected the same from us, but we didn't get embarrassed. I was a little embarrassed, Tabitha told him. I enjoy kissing you, but with that many people watching, it wasn't as wonderful as it could have been. I agree. I should have told everyone to turn away and then kissed you that way. Or you could have saved kissing me that way for when we got home. Bert grinned. What fun would that have been? She shook her head. Do you have chores to do tonight? Usually, but George and Alice are taking care of them tonight. To give us a little more time together before we have to get back to work tomorrow. I suppose that makes sense. I just really want to spend time with you while we can. Without kicking me? I'll only kick you when you deserve it, so maybe you should be careful to behave yourself. He chuckled. We have a late litter of kittens in the barn. Do you want to see them tomorrow evening? She nodded. Do you like cats? He shrugged. I can take them or leave them. It's good to have a few barn cats to make sure there are no mice, but other than that, I have no idea. I've never had a house cat. How old are the kittens? She asked. 5 or 6 weeks, I think. They're eating table scraps now, just like their mama. So, they're old enough to be taken from her. How would you feel if we turned one into a house cat? My friend had one when we were little, and I loved it so much. When she had kittens, I begged my mother for one, but she always said no. So, this is a lifelong dream of yours to have kittens, I guess? It is. He sighed. I'm only letting you have one as a wedding gift. And you're taking care of it on your own. She jumped up from her chair and hurried to him, hugging him from behind. He pushed out his chair and pulled her down on his lap, kissing her. Thank you, she said when he let her come up for air. Get these dishes done quickly and thank me properly, he told her. She giggled and got up and did as she was told. She could be obedient when she agreed with what he wanted. It was other times that were more difficult. He watched her fly around the kitchen and smiled. I guess you can be obedient when you want to be. The kick he received was earned, and he knew it, so he didn't say a thing.